Welcome back. We're now dealing with part 2 of chapter 6, where we're going to be looking at, more stuff with intertemporal budget constraints. So last time we learned about what a constraint was and what a static and a dynamic constraint were. Here what we're going to be doing is we're going to add money, bonds, and then government spending into the constraint. So we're going to introduce a government and then a monetary authority. And it's going to really, the point of all of this is to let us see how the government's choices can sort of take resources from production for its own use. Really, in so many words, I hate to say it, but taxation kind of is theft, and it's simply resource extraction. I'm not okay. The taxation is theft. Maybe is a little hyperbolic there. Maybe don't pay so much attention to that. But in effect, government spending is resource extraction. It is taking resources from one part of the economy and moving them to another part of the economy. And that alters the options that households have. Why is this stuff important? Well, we're going to see how resource availability is affected by governments and how monetary policy can also be affecting these options, not just for the household, but also for the government. Okay, last time we got this right here. This was our resource constraint, right? It was KT to the alpha or output, right? KT to the alpha is our production function. Capital goes in, production output comes out. And that can be split between consumption, consumer goods, right? Buying things like, a TV for your house. And it's split between that and investment goods, right? And investment goods is really the flow of capital over time. So KT plus 1 is the new capital that we're buying. Now, some of KT plus 1 has to go to replace delta times KT units that fell apart. So delta would be the depreciation, the rate of depreciation on physical capital. We went through all that stuff with the roller coasters. So currently, the only options we have are to buy consumer goods or buy capital goods. We can either buy CT or KT plus 1. What if we had holdings of real money balances? Right? This is a money and banking course. Probably need to put money in there. How would that work? Well, we'd still actually just have a flow of money over time. And you'd have to choose between real money balances today and real money balances tomorrow, MT and MT plus 1. And we would control for the effect of inflation because, if there is an increase in nominal money balances and that increase in nominal money balances is not commensurate with the increase in output, then you're going to have a devaluing of money. You're going to have an increase in inflation. So we want to be able to control for that. Now, if we look at just money creation as a flow of time or a flow over time, it'd just be delta M equals 1 plus the rate of inflation times MT plus 1 minus MT. So why do we have that 1 plus pi t, 1 plus inflation times MT plus 1? Well, that's MT plus 1, right? That is future money. We need to know what the future money would be worth in today's terms. Well, that would be giving us that 1 plus pi t. Now, this is real money balance. This is not nominal money balances. Real money balances reflect the amount of real goods and services that a single unit of money can buy for us. Nominal money balances, say capital MT, can be printed by the government all the government wants. Think back to the optimum quantity of money's helicopter drop. So we're dealing with real money balances here. So it's constrained by the amount of real output we have. So if you produce 1 unit of output and 1 unit of real money, or say maybe in this one particular context, 1 unit of nominal money buys 1 unit of output. But if you print an additional unit of nominal money, you're not going to get another unit of real output in doing so. In that case, you'd have 2 units of nominal money and still only 1 unit of real money. And in that case, you got more money chasing too few goods. I think it was Ronald Reagan who said that. Great stuff. I think it was Ronald Reagan who said you've got too much money or too many dollars chasing too few goods. That's basically what we got here. It's inflation. the amount of money circulating increases, but the amount of goods doesn't. So, kind of like with the capital that we were talking about in the last lecture, we decide today how much money we're going to hold tomorrow. So, MT plus 1 is chosen today. So, current money holdings, M sub T, were chosen yesterday. And we choose to hold money because it's useful for transactions, right? It's also nice to hold on to in case of emergencies. And the amount we choose is really determined by an optimization problem, which isn't done here. Actually, you have sort of seen the optimization problem. It was the money in the utility function model. And we had the whole constraint in the money in the utility function model. This is really what we're deriving here. I'm just showing you what the meaning of the constraint is. So I'm just going to add that flow of money into the constraint given by equation 2. Cool. So I've got output, kt to the alpha, it's the thing in pink, equals consumption, ct, plus everything in blue, that's just investment, kt plus 1 minus delta kt. And then I got the flow of money on top of that. So with money added in here, the agent can choose between consumption, capital, and real money balances. If you want to hold more in real money balances, that's fine, but you have to give up a little consumption or a little capital. Why would you be doing that? Well, think of it in terms of saving, right? If you just want to have some cash on hand, well, cash is more liquid than capital. So if you want to increase your money holdings, that's totally fine, but you're not going to have as much capital because capital is not as liquid of an asset as cash is. But you're also going to have to give up your consumption, right? Because if you're consuming stuff, well, sort of by design, you're not saving as much money. So you can consume, you can invest, or you can hold a little bit of money. You're going to do some combination of really all three. So think of it like, you're saving your money for a rainy day fund, which kind of harkens back to Friedman's optimum quantity of money. And this is just a mathematical application of that. Okay, so we have consumption in there, we have investment, capital, and we have money holdings. Maybe you want to buy some bonds too, right? Maybe capital's not doing it for you. Or it's kind of doing it for you, but it's not doing enough for you. Maybe you want to have some bonds. Now, bonds earn a real interest rate, R, lowercase r. So technically, the bond earns a nominal rate. That's what gets cited whenever you buy a bond, which is capital R, but the constraint is expressed in real terms, so we want to have the real interest rate. Don't really worry how we get that. It's really just kind of like dividing by the price level, but then you kind of have to convert stuff into inflation and all that. So just take my word for it. It's like a bastardization of the Fisher equation. So if you bought a bond B sub t yesterday, and you can buy bonds BT plus 1 today, right? Think like you're kind of like putting an order in for the bonds, and then you actually get the bond tomorrow. Now, we discount the future bonds to be in today's term, which gives us 1 plus the real interest rate to the negative 1, or another way to write it is 1 over 1 plus the interest rate, times B sub t plus 1. So we have a flow in bonds given by 1 plus the real interest rate to the negative 1 times BT plus 1 minus BT. Now, you buy a bond from somebody, right? You don't buy a bond out of thin air. So if you buy a bond, you got to buy it from someone, which means there's someone that wants to sell you a bond, right? You can't lend money to somebody unless they want to borrow money from you. I can go to my best friend and say, hey, do you want to borrow $1,000? And if they don't want to borrow $1,000, they'll be like, no. I'll be like, well, shit. I don't know what to do now. I guess I can't lend money to anybody. So you got to have somebody that wants to borrow money for you to be able to lend money. So in equilibrium, the amount of bonds that are sold are equal to the amount of bonds that are bought. Thus, borrowing and lending would sum up to 0. And the interest rate is determined exogenously, meaning it's like chosen outside the model. Now, the interest rate's going to vary. Depending on where it is, it'll induce you to buy more or less bonds, right? If you have a higher interest rate, higher return on bonds, you're probably going to want to buy some more bonds. If you have a lower interest rate, you're probably going to want to buy fewer bonds. Right? It's all kind of going back to the term structure of interest rates and all that. But, your preference to buy more bonds or fewer bonds, that comes from a utility function, which comes from a maximization problem, which we're not going to be dealing with right now, because again, we're just looking at the constraint. We'll look at the optimization stuff a little bit later. We're not going to go too far into it, really just enough so you can kind of see it, maybe play with some of the results. So if you want to hold more bonds, then you can earn an interest rate R each period. And if you want to hold more bonds, well, you consume less today because, well, you kind of have to. You buy less capital because, you can't buy more capital and more bonds. And you're going to have to hold less money. So if you hold money, right, you got more liquidity on hand right now. But if you hold bonds, you have to wait one period to get that money on hand. So for every dollar you put in bonds, you do get $1 times 1 plus the real interest rate tomorrow. So the constraint with capital, money, and bonds added in is KT to the alpha, which is production, right? It's output. And that's equal to the sum of the use of resources. So CT plus KT plus 1 minus delta KT, right? Everything in blue there is investment. Everything in red is the flow of money. Everything in a darker shade of blue, a less pretty shade of blue, in my opinion, is bonds. So capital, money, and bonds holdings are all determined by the agent, and they're constrained by the amount of output that we produce each period, right? So the right-hand side of equation 3 can't exceed the left-hand side of equation 3. Okay, so we've got consumption, we have investment, we have money and bonds. All right, let's add something totally useless in there. Let's add that kid that eats glue in the corner. And what do I mean by that? I mean the government. Government always makes things better, right? Let's add the government to the constraint. The government gets revenue in a number of ways. One, they get revenue from money creation. This is what's known as seigniorage, or MT plus 1. They get money from selling bonds, issuing debt, taking on debt, which is BT plus 1. And they get money from taxes. Any one of these three, the government gets revenue. Now, there are costs and benefits to each of these three. So it's not like they can do one as much as they want. Any combination of these will come with any combination of costs, but there's also a combination of benefits from them. So the government can spend G sub T. And if the budget is balanced, right, meaning they're spending exactly what they're bringing in via tax revenue, then G would be equal to T. So we're going to add G sub T into the constraint in the little brown there. I wonder why I put government in brown. Take a wild guess why that would be. So I add that in there. That gives me equation 4. So now, right, the constraint output is equal to the sum of consumption, investment, money holdings, bond holdings, and the government. So if you add something into that constraint, right, that's less for the other things that can be consumed, or really, I guess, spent on, right? If you add the government in, well, that's fewer bonds you can hold, it's less money you can hold, it's less capital you can buy, and it's less consumption you can have. Because it's taking from some or potentially all of the other terms in equation 4. And we're going to learn a little bit about this in, like, when we start some business cycle theory stuff, but it's what's known as crowding out, where essentially the government comes in and spends a bunch of money, and when they do, they're spending resources that are now no longer available for use within the private sector. Because, again, everything is subject to constraints. So if the government wants to print money to finance their purchases, looking at it in terms of like maybe real money balances isn't the best way to go. So if we have the constraint in nominal terms, well, we just have everything in capital letters now instead of lowercase. But things change a little bit. Well, we don't have that 1 plus pi anymore because it's nominal. If we want to convert it to real, that's where the inflation comes in. And then we have the nominal interest rate instead of the real interest rate on bonds. Now that MT plus 1 minus MT in nominal terms is called seigniorage. That's where the government prints money today to finance their projects. But of course, they have to do so at a cost of higher inflation tomorrow. So if you've ever heard of anything like, it's called modern monetary theory, the idea would be like the government can just print as much money as they want. That would essentially be seigniorage. And of course, the idea behind modern monetary theory is that they can print as much money as they want, but then they tax the money out of circulation because that'll totally work. So if the government wants to print more money, well, that's called seigniorage, and they do so at a cost of higher inflation tomorrow. If the government wants to sell more bonds today, well, they have to borrow more money. And when they do, there's less money available to borrow for other people, which then drives up the nominal interest rate, and then it crowds out private investment. Okay, I guess we're going to talk about it here. So the more the government borrows, the less the private sector gets to use for their own projects. And in which case, you'd better hope the government is going to borrow the money and use the money in a way that is viewed as equally useful by society as whatever the private investment projects were going to be. Doubt that's always the case. So we're going to cover this a little bit more when we get to Ricardian equivalence. This is actually why I'm showing you this before Ricardian equivalence. But the idea here would be if the government needs to spend more than they collect in tax revenue, is the government's budget constraint still being satisfied? Right? If they need to spend more today than what's available today, how screwed are they? Well, actually, they're not that screwed. As long as they can borrow or print money, then the constraint becomes satisfied. Because in this case, taxes are equal to government spending plus 1 plus inflation times MT plus 1 minus MT plus 1 plus the real interest rate to the negative 1 times BT plus 1 minus BT. So running at a deficit doesn't mean the government's budget constraint isn't satisfied. In fact, no matter how much debt the government issues, as long as somebody's buying it, as long as they can convince enough people that their debt is good, that they're good for it, well, the constraint's always going to be satisfied because there's always going to be somebody to buy it. Remember, as long as somebody's willing to buy and there's someone willing to sell, well, then boom, there we go, right? If someone's willing to lend and someone wants to borrow, if I'm willing to lend the amount that you're willing to borrow, hey, works for me. So even if the amount of debt they take on isn't wise, we'll say, their constraint is always satisfied. So even when the government is running a deficit or we're ticking up the national debt, in terms of the government's budget constraint, it's still always satisfied. It's just it's not a balanced budget. Okay, so it's really enough on that for now. This just was a simple introduction to dynamic budget constraints. And we're going to get to some optimization stuff maybe later. But for now, it's really good to know how the government finances the purchases that it makes. And then it tells us what resources are available for the household to choose later. Now, we're going to see why the chapter even exists over the next few chapters, covering Ricardian equivalence, money growth and inflation, and the Phillips curve. But this is a decent building block just when it comes to understanding some of the more advanced macro models that we're going to see later on in the course, like the real business cycle and new Keynesian models. But again, that's a little bit later. We're just kind of setting the stage right now for the fun stuff that comes over the next couple weeks and really the next 2 months. So thank you for watching, and be on the lookout for Chapter 7 next week when I record that.